We are in the first panel, Capitalist Development and Institutional Change. In a way, this classic antinomy suggests the dualism of agency, structure, entrepreneurs, institutional change, and clearly this is the classic question in the study of capitalist economic development, that the dynamics involves the entrepreneurs who are involved in creative destruction. The institutional structures involve the polity and the state. And ever since the early work of Polanyi, this has been on the agenda for economic sociology, to examine this dynamic in the interplay between economic agency and actors and the institutional structure, where this key player is the state. Our first speaker in today's session is Glenn Morgan, professor of international management at the Cardiff University. He has broadly sustained a research program precisely in this area of tension between capitalist development and institutional change. And the theme of his talk today is also the title of a recently edited, published handbook, Capitalism and Capitalism in the 21st Century. And he's the author of several books, The Multinational Firm, Organizing Across Institutional and National Divides, Changing Capitalism, Internationalization, Institutional Change, and Systems of Economic Organization. You can see that all these earlier work clearly are very well represented by the title of this panel. And the second speaker on this panel is Frank Dobbin, professor of sociology at Harvard University, and who has also similarly written broadly in the theme of this panel. Numerous articles published in the top journals of sociology, a book on forging industrial policy that is comparative institutional analysis at its best, and most recently his study of equal opportunity and affirmative action, which began with a series of very important articles published in American Journal of Sociology and American Sociological Review, together with his co-authors, John Meyer, Sutton, and others. But now in this new book, Inventing Equal Opportunity, it brings together a research program that shows that institutional change is not only involving government action and top-down processes, but very, very importantly, the endogenous processes that are endemic that are driven by the firm and actors within the firm, who include not just the obvious economic actor, the CEO, but very importantly, the personnel of the human resource departments, who then took it on their own to broadly define and specify the meaning of equal opportunity way beyond the specification in the legal structure, so that this is an example of the bottom-up endogenous aspects of institutional change driven by corporate entities. So without further comments, I'm very pleased to have Glenn Morgan present the first discussion.
I'm going to be talking about capitalism and capitalisms in the 21st century. I very much want to address the sort of crisis that we've come to. So it will be quite a wide-ranging discussion that hopefully will provoke some interest. But as I say, no regressions. I think Frank's got some of those for you later. Okay. So I won't do much publicity, but here's the latest book, Capitalisms and Capitalism in the 21st Century, which I edited with my colleague Richard Whitley, which is the sort of starting point for the presentation today. Not the end point, so you can't go to that book and find just what I'm saying today. What I'm saying today is trying to develop that further. So I've got 5 basic issues that I'm going to discuss in various length. The first one is why capitalism and capitalisms. Why do we have this sort of confusing dichotomy? I mean, I think Victor's already hinted at that. Comes back to Plenary type dualisms. But I will briefly describe what I understand by that. Secondly, I will talk about what sort of capitalism this is that we're in at the start of the 21st century. And I'll talk very much from my perspective as somebody who works inside a business school, from the perspective of firms and the nature of the organisation of firms and of markets. So I'll try in there and be quite specific about what I see this new form of capitalism as being, and I will introduce a number of examples there from firms that I've been looking at. The third thing that I want to have a go at is to say something about finance. Now, this is a theme which economic sociology has contributed a massive amount to over the last decade, and I want to sort of suggest how it can be linked to the particular perspective that I've got on firms. And you'll see in these sort of subtitles of these sections the sort of themes that I want to bring out. Here, the question of imbalances and risk, and what I've called extraction, who gets what and how out of finance. So this is what I've been describing, what I should call capitalism in the singular, capitalism as an economic system. But clearly what we need to be centrally concerned about is capitalisms, in other words, national contexts in which the effects of the capitalist, more broadly the capitalist dynamic, is felt, and what is happening within particular sorts of contexts. And here I've become increasingly interested in the role that elites and legitimacy will have in relation to the adaptation process in particular forms of capitalism. And then finally, from that, I will look at, or make some comments on what the impact of the crisis has been on capitalism and capitalisms. So let me just very briefly, very crudely, make the distinction here between capitalism, as I want to talk about it, which is this broader economic system, this process of flow of the way in which capital flows around the globe, the way in which trade flows around the globe, across borders, through markets, the way in which labour also, to a degree, flows across borders. And just for the sake of sort of relating it partly to the title of the conference, conceiving of this as the sort of a sphere of disembeddedness, a sphere in which actors loose themselves from national context and engage in movement across borders. And clearly I see this process of engaging in movement across borders of capital, technology, trade, etc., as something which has speeded up and become more and more important over the last 2 decades. And in contrast, we have capitalisms, the sphere of fixity, the sphere of national embeddedness, the sphere of institutions and the state. The Polanyian distinction between markets and institutions comes through here. So institutions as being embedded in a particular national context. So that's my initial sort of framing, and now I'm going to talk briefly about what I understand by capitalisms and connecting capitalism and capitalisms. So, as I've said, this is very much a sort of Polanyian perspective that markets, capitalism needs institutions. We have a variety of ways of framing that. We have discussions about, for example, Boltanski and Chiapello, new spirits of capitalism. We have terminology about legitimation structures. And the sense that in order to make the market work, populations need to be drawn into that process. And in fact, capitalist organizations need forms of predictability to underpin contracting exchange markets, etc. Now, these institutions have generally been at the national level, and so that's why we have spent so much time, some of us, trying to talk about different forms of capitalism, different varieties of capitalism in the Hall and Soskius, national business systems in Whitley's terms, trying to sort of capture how institutions over a path-dependent period have shaped and created certain sort of national forms of capitalism. So there is that national sphere of institutions, but there's also an international sphere of institutions, although the nature of that I don't think has been much related yet to the sort of questions that we have. So things like currencies, the way in which currencies are negotiated, the relative values of currencies, the foreign exchange, the relative importance of forms of international law, etc. But for the moment, I'm going to concentrate on this dualism between capitalisms and capitalism. Now, if we just state some obvious points, if we think about capitalism as an expansive system, at that point, and we can think about that in terms of the post-war period in the first instance of Keynesian expansion, when capitalism is expanding, national capitalisms also have the possibility of expanding. But when capitalism as a system wavers, as it is wavering at the moment, then national capitalisms and institutions also waver. And when national capitalisms collapse, this may infect capitalism as a whole, as we saw in the interwar period, and as we're sort of experiencing in terms of the uncertainties of what's going to happen within the Eurozone, where even the collapse of a relatively small economy, the Greek economy, is creating all sorts of tensions across Europe, but in the broader economic system. So these two things, capitalism and capitalisms, are integrally related, and we need to see the two together and see the tensions that are generated and how these processes are organized. Okay, so let me start with capitalism. So what sort of capitalism are we in now? And basically what my argument is that we're moving towards a more diversified form of capitalism, which are a more diverse business models. These business models enable firms to organize across a range of national boundaries and to also incorporate a range of different types of production system within them. So if we think from the bottom left-hand corner of a process of moving up to the top right-hand corner, where the world, where products and projects and processes become more and more complex, it's not that we have left behind the world of simple products. So on the right here we have Chinese workers making disposable cigarette lighters, which is 70% of the world's production of disposable cigarette lighters goes on in one town in China. And on the left, Chinese firms also make most of the Christmas decorations that we use in the 20th century. So there are still plenty of sort of simple commodities that are being produced. The issue is not that everything has become more complex, but that there are a range and there's much more diversity of products. And this is what I want to talk about, how this range emerges and what its implications are. So let me give you one example which sort of illustrates part of what I'm looking at, which is the making of spectacle lenses. There's one company based in Paris called ЛЭСИ, which is the largest maker of spectacle lenses in the world. It has 25% of the global market. Now, if we think about spectacle lenses, we can see them at one end as relatively simple commodities, and we now can buy spectacles in supermarkets, so long as we're not too worried about exactly about the cost and exactly how they are going to affect our vision. But there's also a market for very highly differentiated spectacle lenses. So ЛЭСИ actually makes 100 million unique lenses per year. In other words, 100 million different variations of the spectacle lens. And those variations are made through a system of engineering on a basic sort of framework of different types of lenses. So this is a very sort of complex system of a sort of personalization of products. So one of the things that I think, if we think about this, it's not actually, it's not unusual. If we take, for example, the car industry now, buying a new car is essentially about personalizing the car. This is, the examples here are from a study by a Financial Times journalist who did the analysis on Toyota. So if you take the example of Toyota, a mass producer, it produces over 8 million cars every year. But there are actually 1.7 million variations of cars. So actually the likelihood is that the most cars that are going to be produced in exactly the same way is going to be 5. So if you think about this, we've moved a huge distance from Fordist production, you can have any car you like so long as it's black, towards a situation where the producer has a massive task of coordination, bringing information together as to what the customer wants, but also bringing together all the relevant components from different suppliers, many of them distributed in different parts of the world, engaged in different elements of the car production process and of component manufacture, and organising them in factories, again, that are distributed around the world, where the correct input of labour, the correct input of technology has to be decided. So the sort of capitalism then that we're starting to see, as I say, I think it is more diverse, but it's also hugely more complex in terms of the coordinated capacities and the distribution of those coordinated capacities across different parts of the world. Clearly, if we stick with cars for the moment, and that's not a great screen for seeing this, but what we see with cars is a change in the market, the rise of China to become the major market, also the major producer of cars, with places like Brazil and Russia catching up very quickly. So the context then of this sort of capitalism which I'm describing is one that is highly internationalized, highly diversified. There are, as I'll talk about in a minute, many different market opportunities, different ways for firms to make money in this system, but the system is one that is very spread, very diverse. Now, if we take another set of products which reveal this changing nature of capitalism, one that is very important, I think, is in consumer electronics, which reveal very much the rapidity of change, the rapidity with which industries are being reconstructed, and where opportunities to make money are becoming more and more difficult to work out in advance where that's going to happen and to keep that position. So if we talk about electronics, clearly what we're seeing is a fusion between electronics, internet and telecommunications, and we're seeing a rapid sort of, as I say, restructuring of this process so that the music industry, the video industry is having to change and to work out how to make money here. Cameras, you know, increasingly we all have cameras on our phones or on our tablets. Computing is shifting onto phones and tablets. Computer games, again, massive new industry. All of this is having impacts on retailing, social interaction, identity, etc. Now, the sort of argument that I'm trying to make then is that in this new diversified form of capitalism, there are multiple models, multiple ways in which money can be made, but also high levels of uncertainty. What are the places where money can be made in this system? What we do know is that in this system, the firms are highly geographically mobile. They're also picking resources and partners and others to do business with from a variety of different national contexts. What was previously contained within the large multinational firm is no longer contained in that way. We've got disintegrated relations, the things that Gary Giraffi talked about with regard to global value chains. And so we see the development of new forms of network governance, new ways to actually manage this process. And that process has become more intense over the last over the last decade. If we think, for example, of phones, the speed with which mobile phone technology has moved, the speed with which that has revolutionized so many different industries. This indicates the sort of speed of this disembodied phenomena disembodied phenomena that I've been talking about capitalism and business models. But there is, again, as I've emphasized, the problem of value creation in uncertain markets. How do you, how does a firm actually get a position where it can survive and extract value? And here we start to move back towards the question of national capitalisms, in terms of the management, shareholder relationships, expert knowledge, and issues of rent extraction. Let me go to one more firm, sector level example, which is of smartphones. The speed of creation of this market I've already talked about, but if we think about it, and I guess everybody in the room can remember an age before mobile phones. For me, the age of mobile phones started in about 1998, the first mobile phone that I had. But the speed of shift in generational terms from the phone as a way of communicating both through text messaging and through phoning people, then into the joy of the internet-connected phone, the BlackBerry, in the mid-2005, 2006, becoming, sort of changing the terms on which the mobile phone industry works. And then, a few years after that, the rise of Apple and the rise of Apple's iPhone. And what we see in that period is the difficulty of incumbents, to go back to this problem of value extraction, incumbents who get a certain position, but then find it very difficult to move on. So we see at the moment Nokia, which is still selling lots and lots of mobile phones, but is not making money to any great extent, and is facing high levels of uncertainty. Similarly, the originators of BlackBerry is hovering on the brink of whether it can continue or not. The Japanese mobile phone manufacturers, Toshiba and Sony, are struggling to get a foothold. Instead, we see a situation which is dominated by Apple, and where Samsung is a rising and significant power, partly because of its coalitional elements with others, firms such as Google and HTC, to create the Android operating system. So we see a very rapid change here in the industry. And if we look at the iPhone, to again sort of try and get a grasp on the geography of this, the interconnectedness of it, the networked nature of it. This comes from, it's in Marsh's book, but it also originates from a consultancy who specialise in sort of opening up technology products and pricing each of the different elements in that. You'll see that in there, what was calculated was that the cost of manufacturing the iPhone was $179. Now the iPhone is assembled in China by Foxconn, and so that $179 from a purchase price of around $500 when this was done, that $179 represents value that is there in China that Apple pays for. When we look at the added value in China, in other words, how much of that actually goes to the assembler in China, to Foxconn, per phone, that's calculated at just $6.5. So a very small proportion of this is going into China. The gross profit margin was calculated here as $320, 160 going to the distributors and retailers, and 160 retained by Apple themselves, of which $100 was for technology and design, and $60 was what they term retained profits. So if we're looking to understand Apple's cash mountain of 100 billion, Apple gave no dividends from 1995 to 2012. Instead, it accrued that as the cash mountain that enables them to buy and to develop their products further. Now, it's interesting to just go into that $179 that constitutes components for the Apple iPhone, the 3G. When we look at that list of the major contributors, we see that Toshiba, the Japanese company, produces nearly $50 worth of components for the iPhone. Samsung, the Korean company, which is a competitor of iPhones and is, as you no doubt know, has been involved in a number of legal battles with Apple about intellectual property. Samsung is also a significant manufacturer of components for the iPhone. Similarly, we see in their German company, Infineon, as a major supplier of components. So, whilst the iPhone is assembled in China through Foxconn, itself a company owned in Taiwan, whereas it's assembled in China, its components come from sites such as Japan, such as Germany, and such as the US. So this world of capitalism that has emerged over the last 20 or so years is one of high levels of uncertainty in which firms are engaged in experimentalism. They're held by processes of path dependency and processes of inertia. They're also facing disruptive technologies that can change their business very quickly. So Nokia seemed unable, even though it was a very advanced technological company, seemed unable to anticipate the arrival of the iPhone. There are many issues about knowledge leakage. I've already mentioned patent wars between Apple and Samsung. So this is what I want to emphasize here, is that this is not a world in which any firm can take for granted exactly what its situation is going to be. It's a very uncertain context in which there are high levels of risk that are involved, and managing and coordinating these risks are very high. So this form of capitalism has obvious impacts on capitalisms. Pressure on labour is one that we often focus on. Pressure on fiscal position of the state through corporate tax revenues. Pressure on innovation systems and education. Pressure for open markets in the public sector. Pressure for business-friendly state and politics. So, on the one hand, we have this development, this pressure from a new disembedded form of capitalism, and on the other hand, we have the effort of states to respond to that, to engage with this form of capitalism, to persuade investors to come in, and to have the sorts of skills, the sort of capacities in their system that this requires. Now, before I go on any further, I want to briefly just ask the question, well, how does all this relate to finance? How's this, because so far I haven't mentioned much about finance at all. In terms of economic sociology, of course, there are a lot of different perspectives on finance. There's the discourse of finance dominance, the study of elites and the role of banks as central players in elites. There's also the study of the anthropology, so to speak, of financial markets. And there's questions of credit and debt formation and its impact on social inequality. But none of these quite gets to what interests me about finance, which is related to these developments in the broader economy that I've been describing. As I see it, the firms that are engaged in this broader economy, if we take an example like Apple with $100 billion, we ask the question, well, what happens to that $100 billion? Where does that feed in? Because it's not just sitting in their back office, it is feeding into this financial system. And if we think about the question of the broader division of labour between China and the US and the division of finance there, again, we think that that comes from, that's rooted in the different, the trajectory of different forms of manufacturing and the fact that China has become the dominant workhouse of the world and the US has vacated a lot of those industries as the UK did before it. And so what interests me is how capitalism itself generates these financial funds, and then how these are these funds become delegated to financial intermediaries. These financial intermediaries who are looking at the search for yield, they're looking, as we talked about, the wall of money that came into New York and into London in the 2000s, the money that came from China circulating its surpluses, that came from the Middle East circulating petrodollars, that came from the savers in Japan, the savers in Germany. All of these funds were finding their way in, and they were finding their way from those particular sources because of the way in which firms in those particular contexts were highly competitive, were organized. And so this creates these significant imbalances and uncertainties as this money funnels its way into London and New York. And just in terms of what I've got up here, it seems to me that the three things that happen. Firstly, that substantial amounts of these monies are basically just extracted by the financial elites. They're extracted in terms of bonus payments, in terms of trading gains, in many different ways. But actually what happens is that all of that just gets rooted into the financial elites. But it also creates inflated, mispriced assets, and then it creates the possibility of the asset, of the collapse of the asset boom. So the point I'm trying to suggest is that these things are not disconnected, that the financial crisis has its roots in the way in which capitalism as a productive system evolved and the imbalances and uncertainties that emerged from that system. But what did that mean in terms of the state? Again, as I've already mention the competition between states to attract multinational firms, to attract this activity, led to various sorts of reforms and efforts. And again, there's a big literature talking about how there's a nationally distinctive embedded quality to the way in which neoliberal policies gets implemented in particular contexts. Now, I've used the term great moderation, Bernanke's term, taking that to show the shift from the Keynesian, the volatility, so to speak, of the Keynesian era into this more constrained volatility of the period of the neoliberal hegemony from about the 1985 through to 2008. And so what I'm interested in here is, go to the next slide, is who are the main actors involved in sort of shaping this process of the adaptation between capitalism, neoliberal globalization, and national institutional structures. And here, I think we can go back to the language of elites. Now, I know this is a very problematic language for a lot of people, but I think that that what we can see when we look across different countries is that there's a path dependency process here, that elites are historically constructed, but when the period of the 1990s and the development of financialization, the development of neoliberalism emerges, what we see are different processes of adaptation. I think this is something that could be more interestingly studied, that we see the rise of financial elites, their power and influence very strongly in the US and the UK, but I don't think we necessarily see it to anything like the same extent in other European countries or going across into Asian countries. We don't see that. We see different sorts of adaptations. We see, for example, in France, what strikes me is a sort of an effort to negotiate this adaptation between globalization, financialization, and existing institutions. Struggle around that in a way that in the UK there was no particular struggle. The financial elites came very quickly and strongly to power. So I think that we can place elites more into this story, because one of the things that happened in 2008, and it was a strong populist discourse, was the idea of the failure of elites. And we hear that sort of discussion, that sort of language in the Eurozone, the failure of the Greek elites, the failure of the Irish elites, failure of British, etc., to actually negotiate a way through the financial crisis. And so the idea that elites with different types of sort of ideas and different discourses and different modes of organization make a difference to how this crisis is being managed. So that in the UK, we have an elite that the dominant political elite is still is very much about austerity and about cutting the state and about reducing debt, the debt of the state. And whilst that's a common language throughout Europe, it's implemented in a variety of different ways. But it's not a common language everywhere. There's still some places where there's much more nationalistic forms of resistance to that. There are some places, I can think of like the Nordic capitalisms, where there's still a different language, that whatever form of restructuring occurs as a result of the crisis needs to be one that still holds to certain values of social democracy, that still holds to a particular way of working. And I think we can learn quite a lot by looking at these different adaptations. So I'm nearly at the end. Then the financial crisis, austerity, I think has challenged elites, but not in a way that gives us any optimism about what form of alternative might exist. But what we're seeing is a struggle in which there are still high levels of uncertainty. So just my final two slides then. As we still have on the one hand these firms that are looking for new opportunities, that are developing new networks of governance, that are engaging across the world. And then we have national capitalisms that are finding it increasingly difficult to manage their populations, to manage their fiscal crises, to manage the process of development. And in contexts like the Eurozone, where we've got collective institutions, that's even more problematic. So, whilst on the one hand, capitalism has this restless urge to expand, it's a restless urge that delivers unanticipated, unpredicted results, and it also places under threat in the current era the sort of social, institutional context that is necessary for its expansion. So we seem to be in a situation of strong capitalism and weak capitalisms, which is probably the worst possible sort of situation to be in, because it means that potential for crisis, potential for spillover, potential for disorder, such as we see in parts of the Eurozone and elsewhere, is likely to increase.
What I want to discuss is the changing institutions of capitalism in the American firm, the ways in which the American firm and corporate strategy have changed very radically since 1980, largely as a response to the crisis of the 1970s, and how market intermediaries played a role in choosing the new form of what is now called shareholder value. And I want to argue that the reason we see much greater risk-taking among firms, and the reason we saw the Enron, Tyco, WorldCom crisis, and then subsequently the investment banking crisis of 2008, the reason boils down to this change in corporate strategy, a change in the institution of capitalism as it was embodied in American firms between 1980 and today. And I want to argue that this happened because of the rise of institutional investors who play an increasingly important role in shaping corporate strategy. Now, when we think of institutional investors, they're the groups that invest mostly American pension fund money. Of course, they also invest some of the capital that Glenn was talking about coming from outside of the United States. And between 1980 and 2005, they became increasingly important to American firms. And they came to define what the new conception of control is. And my argument, put simply, is they defined a conception of control around shareholder value, and they began to use the term shareholder value. And their idea was to distinguish the interests of managers from the interests of shareholders and try to get managers to work for shareholders. But what I want to argue is that instead of trying to get managers to work for shareholders, they got managers to work for institutional investors themselves. That is, what managers started to do was in the interest of institutional investors, not in the interest of shareholders. And that's because institutional investors encourage firms to adopt several parts of the shareholder value menu, several items from the shareholder value menu, but not the whole menu. They got them to adopt the parts of the shareholder value menu that encourage firms to take a lot of risk with the prospect of making a lot of money for institutional fund managers themselves. That is take-home pay for institutional fund managers themselves. And I want to argue that this is what led firms to behave like Enron and Tyco and WorldCom did. And it's also what led investment banks to behave like they did in the years leading up to 2008, and to embrace a set of policies and strategies that put them at great risk for failure. This all started with the crisis of the early 1970s, the oil shock, the stagflation. The United States had a stock market that didn't move beyond inflation for 12 years. So everybody in the 1970s was arguing that there was a problem with American capitalism as it was being worked out. And American firms, the Fortune 500, had a kind of crisis of confidence in their core management model. And what we saw in those years is a bunch of different strategies for altering this model. One of them was Japanese management, and if any of you taught organization theory in the United States in the 1980s, you'll remember that the students were demanding more weeks on Japanese management. Even in the early 1990s, my organizations course went from all US to half Japan. Now it's back down to no Japan, because if you mention Japan in the course, they ask, why the hell are you mentioning Japan? But for a long time, everybody thought Japan was the answer. A bunch of people were arguing that the answer to our problem, to America's problem, was Italian small firm networks. Andrew Schoenfeld had a book on France, on French industrial capitalism, arguing that modern capitalism was state-led capitalism, and a lot of people bought that book. What won here, the solution that won to this crisis, was agency theory, as spelled out in Jensen and Meckling's 1976 piece. And the diagnosis there was what I said a moment ago. There was a conflict of interest between management and the people who actually own the firm, who should be their bosses. And management was just looking out for its own interests. And in particular, what managers were doing was they were building huge empires that would prevent their firms from ever dying, so that their firms were at no risk. And in building huge empires, they increased their salaries, not by making more money for shareholders, but just by running more businesses. So they were building huge conglomerates. And in those years, in 1980, CEO pay was simply a function of how many employees you had and how much you had in terms of assets. So agency theorists argued, this is the wrong incentive system for managers. You're encouraging them to build huge, low-profit firms. What you need to do is make them entrepreneurial. So you need to align the interests of executives with the interests of shareholders. So the way to do that is stop them from building these huge empires, encourage them to make money for investors, and put in some monitoring so that somebody will oversee them, so they can't just do whatever they want. And the monitoring took several forms. So here are agency theories, prescriptions for value, how you make money for investors. One, you should use stock options rather than salary to pay executives. And that's a way to align the interests of executives who, with stock options, get a big bonus every time they can increase the value of the stock from one year to the next, with the interests of shareholders who are looking for share price to go up. And it's one reason, for example, Apple doesn't feel it has to pay dividends anymore. You make your money if you hold Apple stock by the share price. They call for financial transparency, and that's a way to allow monitoring of firms. So put everything out there so investors can decide whether to invest in you or not. Industrial focus. They called for firms to stop building these huge empires made up of businesses in 25 different industries that managers couldn't possibly understand. That is, industries they couldn't possibly understand. They called them to stop that strategy and focus on a single industry that they knew well, that they could manage well. They called for debt financing, and that's because these huge conglomerates in 25 industries were taking the profits that were churned out by successful firms in growing industries, and they were plowing them back into other investments that were irrational, just so they could build their empires. They called for executive equity holding. The best way to align the interests of executives and the interests of shareholders is to make executives long-term shareholders. So they'll do everything in the interest of shareholders. That is, they'll look for high risk, high reward investments, but they'll also do things to contain those risks. And the final thing they called for is independent boards. They wanted boards to be able to throw out CEOs who were incompetent or who were acting to serve themselves rather than shareholders. The problem, so this prescription sort of contains some pro-entrepreneurial things to make firms more risk-seeking and to make firms try to make more money, but it also contains some risk reduction things. Stock options are pro-entrepreneurial. Go out there and try to make a lot of money this year. Financial transparency is risk reduction. We want to know everything you're doing so we can make investment decisions. Industrial focus is pro-entrepreneurial. Put it all into one business and bet on that business. Debt financing is pro-entrepreneurial because it prevents you from using all of your profits from one area. You have to give those back to the shareholders, and you have to borrow money if you want to invest in a new enterprise. You have to borrow money and plan to pay the interest in the loan. Executive equity holding is supposed to be risk reducing because if you hold long-term equity in the firm through some kind of long-term incentive plan where you can't sell it, then you're not going to do anything that's going to cause the firm, you're not going to take any risks that might cause the firm's price to collapse. And independent boards are risk moderating because they're going to challenge CEOs who do crazy things or throw them out. It turns out that fund managers, institutional investors, they are the people who popularized the shareholder value idea. They're the people who went around to institutional investors, went around to boards, to executives and said, we want you to do these things. We'll invest in you if you do these things. And there's a lot of evidence that during the 80s, 90s, and up until today, institutional investors are going into firms and twisting their arms to do these things. Or at least, that's what gets in the press. But when you look at what they actually push firms to do, and this is what I'm going to show you later. When you look qualitatively at what they were saying behind the scenes about what they wanted firms to do, and when you look at the evidence of how they tried to change the behavior of the firms they were invested in, it turns out that fund managers really wanted firms to embrace stock options and financial transparency, and they didn't care about the other things. So in public, they talked about the other things because they're part of this broader prescription. But in private, they didn't really push the other things. And that's because stock options and financial transparency were the two things that were in the direct interest of institutional investors themselves. And the other things sometimes conflicted with their interests. So let's take stock options. During this period, institutional investors came to be paid. Almost all their income came from bonuses. And the bonuses were based on how much the value of their portfolio went up from one year to the next. So if you could double the value of your portfolio from one year to the next, you made a huge amount of money. If the portfolio value collapsed the next year, you didn't have to give anything back. So from year to year, as an investment manager, you're really interested in seeing, you don't care about the downside. You don't lose anything if you might lose your job, but you don't lose any cash if if your portfolio collapses. But if your portfolio skyrockets, you make a ton of money. So they like stock options because this gives CEOs exactly the same incentive structure. Because stock options also, if you can increase the price of your own firm from one year to the next, you make a lot of money. If the share price of your firm collapses, you don't lose any money. So they both had an upside-only bonus system. That is, they both did now that fund managers got firms to adopt stock options. So they pushed really hard for stock options because so notice it aligns the interests of managers, not with the interests of shareholders, but with the interests of the intermediaries. Because shareholders don't want to see share price drop in 2 years. Whereas mutual fund managers, they don't care so much. Institutional investors like financial transparency because it gave them information to make investment decisions with. Firms hadn't been giving out a lot of financial information. They started giving out much more. And this is one of the things, as we'll see, institutional investors really pushed for. Industrial focus, institutional investors didn't care about this because while conglomerates sometimes are undervalued, if you're a big conglomerate and you sell off a bunch of divisions, for the next few years you don't make any money because of reorganization costs. And remember, institutional investors like to see year-to-year increases. So we see in the institutional investment literature a lot of talk about the fact that, yeah, it's a shame, deconglomeration is a good idea, but if you deconglomerate, they lose money for a while, so maybe we don't really want to see them do that. Debt financing, they don't particularly care about, partly because if you finance expansion with debt, it's a while before you make any money. So in the short term, your balance sheets don't look any better. Executive equity holding in the long run, well, that would make firms less risk-seeking, less entrepreneurial. And so institutional investors don't particularly care about that. And board independence had not ever been shown to increase profits or to increase share price. There have been a bunch of studies of that. So they don't care about that. Now, some of these other things do become popularized in these years. Securities analysts, as Ezra Zuckerman has shown, encourage firms to become more focused, to deconglomerate. And hostile takeover firms encourage debt financing. They do that both they buy firms with debt, and so those firms suddenly have huge debt loads, and firms take on a lot of debt to avoid being taken over by hostile takeover firms. Executive equity holding and independent boards don't spread though. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to show you kind of what happened, and then that is with the spread of these things. So first I'll show you the pattern of the spread of these things, and then I'll show you some regressions, as Glenn implied, some regressions that will show just how institutional investors pushed stock options and financial transparency and really didn't give a shit about the other things. And then I'll talk about the effects of these things, this new institutional organization of capitalism. I'll talk about the effects of these changes on corporate risk-seeking and institutional and investment bank risk-seeking. These last two things, remember, these are two things that are supposed to limit corporate risk-taking. So they're the parts of the equation that are constraining entrepreneurialism. And as I'll show you, companies don't do them. So one of the reasons firms begin to listen to institutional investors is that institutional investors start to control all the money. And that's partly because pension regulations change. Now we all have 401k plans. 401k plans are usually managed by these institutional investors. This is This is billions under management by institutional investors from 1980 to 2005. It's so small in 1980 that I can't even figure out what it is on the scale. But $5 trillion by 2005. And this is as a share of all as a share of all of the companies in our sample. We have a sample of 726 firms, and everything I show you is going to be based on that 726 firms, all of which at some point in this period were Fortune 500 companies. So think of this as a time-varying Fortune 500 list. So we see that at the beginning, about 30% of shares of Fortune 500 companies were controlled by institutional investors, and by the end, about 70% of shares were controlled by institutional investors. So this makes firms pay a lot more attention to institutional investors, to institutions, to places like Vanguard and Fidelity. The problem is that the problem will be that firms embrace risk, industrial focus. You're only in one industry, you're much more likely to go bankrupt. Debt financing. You have a heavy debt load, you're much more likely to go bankrupt. Stock options, they encourage executives to do crazy things that are high risk, high reward, that might cause the firm to make a lot of money or that might cause it to fail. And notice that none of the Wall Street executives whose firms failed are bankrupt now. So this was a strategy that worked for them, that is doing things that are very high risk, high reward. But as I said, they didn't embrace the constraints on risk. The one constraint they embraced was financial transparency. Of course, as we know now, financial transparency involved a lot of lying and cheating. So they opened their books, but the numbers in the books were often made up. And we can see that because there's been a steady increase in the number of restatements of earnings. And a restatement of earnings means, oops, we lied by $1 billion, we didn't make that much money. Here are our real earnings. But of course, the restatements come out after the CEO has already made his money from the uptick in the stock price and cashing in a stock option. So average diversification in a group of firms that gets much bigger, diversification goes down significantly over time. So they do de-diversify, which is part of the prescription. But as I said, as we'll see, this wasn't because institutional investors cared about it. They didn't care. Securities analysts made them do this. Debt to equity ratio. So if you see the top line, firms that had, in this Fortune 500 group, those at the 75th percentile of debt, they go from about 80 cents on the dollar in debt, that is, for each dollar of equity, 80 cents of debt. They go to about $1.20. And even at the 50th percentile, they go from about 40 cents to about 60 cents. This goes from 63 to 2005. And I show you such a long timeline because you can see that debt was pretty steady for a long time. And then we get agency theory, which says debt is good because debt prevents firms from just spending their profits to buy new businesses. So debt goes way up, and it stays up. Here's CEO compensation. So if you look at 1984, this is the same stable set of firms. But these CEOs are, this is median. Some guys make a lot more money. They're all guys, pretty much. But they were making about $500,000 a year in salary, almost all of it in salary. And then over this period, they're making about $3.5 million a year by the end. And almost all of it is in variable pay. That is, it's all in options and bonuses, which they get for increasing the share price from year to year. So suddenly, all of their income hinges on whether they can make the share price go up. And that creates a huge incentive to do things that might cause the share price to go up, but might cause it to go down. Because remember, they don't lose anything if the share price goes down, so they still get that base salary of now $600,000 a year, even if the share price goes down. In fact, what they usually do is retime the options so they make money anyway. So this is average equity holdings. Remember, so stock options, or variable pay based on how much the stock price goes up, have exploded. So executives have a lot more money to spend now on equity in their own firm. Do they spend it? This is 92 to 2005, but if we extend it back to 80, it's a flat line. Throughout this period, executives, CEOs, hold about 1.5% of the shares of their firms. This was actually the thing that Jensen and Meckling said firms should do. They said the one thing you should do is you should force executives to hold shares of the firm. They're not doing it. And boards have a way to do this through long-term incentive plans that are just as easy to implement as stock options. But boards go for stock options and not for executive equity. And so it means that when Enron collapses, the guys at the top don't own much equity. All their money is somewhere else. And that's exactly why the guys at Lehman Brothers didn't lose any money when Lehman Brothers collapsed, because they were diversified. They didn't hold any money. They didn't hold any substantial amount of stock in the firm. So remember, you're supposed to appoint an outside chair of the board. And that's because the chairman of the board doesn't fire the CEO if the board doesn't fire the CEO if the chairman of the board is the CEO. So this line is supposed to be going down. That is, fewer and fewer CEOs are supposed to be the chairman of the board. But the opposite happens. It goes up. And why is that? Because institutional investors don't care. So they're not actually trying to get firms to do this. Even though in the New York Times, when they get interviewed, they'll say, we need more board independence, but they don't encourage firms to do this. What firms do instead is they increase outside directors. So instead of having members of the executive team on the board, they put in more outsiders. That would work, except the only firms that actually increase outside directors are the ones where the CEO is chairman of the board. And who do they put on the board? People they went to business school with. They put their friends on the board. So board independence does not increase. They also decrease the number of directors, which is supposed to be a way to make the board more agile. But one thing we see is CEOs are not fired at a higher rate now than they were in 1980. They were supposed to be fired more often. We do see increases in financial transparency. So just look at the solid line here. This is whether they have a CFO, Chief Financial Officer, and firms put in CFOs in order to provide more information and transparency to markets. Let's just look at the top line, the solid line here. This is the percent of firms meeting forecasts. So here's some evidence that they actually are providing more information to markets. So every quarter, analysts estimate, securities analysts estimate how much each firm will report in earnings. And then several different businesses put together these estimates and they make a consensus estimate. They give us the average. So so what you can see by the solid line is that up until the early 90s, about half the time companies beat the estimates and half the time they fail to beat the estimates. So that's saying half the time they're over, half the time they're under. But very suddenly they figure out, oh, all we have to do is we have to give them our profits before we make them public. So they start issuing pre-announcements of their profits, that is, giving more transparency to markets, in principle. And suddenly, 70% of firms are meeting or beating analysts' forecasts. So, which you might say analysts are much more likely to be right, but in fact, firms have figured out how to game this. So I have two models to show. The first one is How does institutional holding, that is the percent of shares held by an institution, by all institutions, small or large, how does it affect the likelihood that you will implement all of these each of these shareholder values reforms? So how are institutional investors influencing firm behavior? And then the next set is, okay, for the firms that implement these reforms, what do institutional investors do? Do they buy more of their shares? So one is their influence in adoption, and then the other is their reaction. So if you're an institutional investor, are you buying more shares of firms that make the CEO independent? So I'm going to show you I'm just going to show you what's relevant in this slide. These are mostly fixed effects models. I can talk about the modeling later, but if you want. So this is just part of the top line. So institutional investors are saying to the New York Times that they want firms to de-diversify. But if you look at the first highlighted figure under institutional ownership, firms that have higher institutional ownership are not more likely to de-diversify. And that's because institutions do not lobby them behind the scenes to de-diversify. They don't care. Or they don't like de-diversification because of the short-term costs of reorganization. Debt to equity. Institutional investors are supposed to like debt. They don't like debt. In fact, if you have higher institutional ownership, you're less likely to take on debt. That's what we see there. Percent outside directors. Okay, institutions say you should have more outside directors, and indeed firms do have more outside directors if they have higher institutional holdings. But they're not encouraging firms to appoint an independent chair. That is, they're not encouraging firms to make the CEO and the chairman of the board different people. And this is the second part of that same row. So, do institutional holdings cause firms to embrace these shareholder value practices? Analyst coverage. Yes. So if institutions hold a lot of your shares, firms try to seek more analyst coverage, more people covering the firm. Dispersion in forecasts. So, I just got off the plane 2 hours ago, so let me know if I do that again. Dispersion in analyst forecasts. So, are analysts making similar forecasts? If they're making similar forecasts, it means they have a lot of the same information. So firms are giving out a lot of financial information. So it looks like firms give out more financial information when there's greater institutional ownership. And remember, these are fixed effects, so that this means if a firm gets more institutional ownership, it's giving out more information. CEO bonus and stock options, big significant effect there. So firms with a lot that have growing institutional ownership increase CEO bonuses and stock options. But do they increase CEO equity through long-term incentive plans? No. And that's because institutional investors are not pushing for that. Okay, last set of regressions. So this is the second half, right, where firms do these things, and then we look at, okay, well, how do institutional investors respond to that? The model on the left is the model we can look at for most variables. Some of the variables were only available for a later period, so there's a reduced model. There's a shorter time period for that one. So what do institutional investors respond positively to? They love increases in analyst coverage. They love when firms meet analyst forecasts. Analyst coverage, meet analyst forecasts. Dispersion in forecasts, they want that reduced, right? Because less dispersion means they all are basing their forecasts on the same information. And a CFO, they love when firms put in a CFO. They buy more shares of firms that move in all four of these directions. Do they care about outside directors? No. You appoint more outside directors, they don't care. Do they care about board size after you've done it? No. Do they care if you appoint an independent chairman? Yes, they don't like it because they buy more of your shares if you make the chairman, the CEO, the chairman of the board. Because in these models, they're fixed effects. Do they care about de-diversification? They don't care. Do they care about debt? They don't like debt, even though they're supposed to like debt. So here, we saw that they were influencing firms in one direction. That is, they were pushing, especially CEO bonus and options and transparency, and the other things they weren't doing what they were expected to do by agency theory. And then here we see when, after firms do these things, they buy more shares of those. And then we see in the top right panel, for the reduced time period, they buy more shares if the firm increases the bonus and stock option percent of overall compensation. But they don't care about stock ownership, about whether CEOs own long-term equity in the firm. So what happens is we came partway to the shareholder value paradigm, but what firms did is they only institutionalized the parts that institutional investors were interested in. And they institutionalized some other things, but they were all risk promoting. So industrial focus, you're only in one industry. That makes you much more likely to fail, because if you're in 3 industries and you have a bad year in one, you can often survive. Debt financing, that puts firms at high risk, as we'll see in a minute. Stock options encourage risk-taking, as I said. But the constraints on risk, they don't institutionalize. They don't increase executive equity holding, and they don't increase board independence. And as I said before, boards are not firing executives who take undue risk or who don't conform to other parts of the shareholder value model. The one constraint on risks that they do take is financial transparency. But that's mostly not to constrain risk, but because institutional investors just want as much information as they can get, so they really push hard for that. The problem for the economy more generally is that investment banks followed suit. They jumped on this bandwagon too. So between 1970 and 1999, all investment banks went from being partnerships to being publicly owned. And they did this partly because they saw that CEOs were making more money than they were making. And they saw that you could make more money from increases in stock options than you could from being a partner in an investment bank, for a bunch of different reasons. So they got jealous of the CEOs of GE and GM, and they went public, and also now their risk is reduced, because when they were partners of, if you're a partner in an investment bank, Lehman Brothers, if that went down before it went public, those people would all be broke. Because if you're a partner in an investment bank, you have to leave your capital in for the bank to use. And that's where all your money is. So that change made investment banks much more risk-seeking, and investment banks themselves started acting like, investment bankers started acting like stock option CEOs in other kinds of firms. We see in other analyses that banks did indeed embrace stock options and debt financing in a big way. Briefly, what happened then is companies like Enron in 2001 and Lehman Brothers in 2008, they failed, and they failed while they were taking unprecedented risk. Enron, it turns out, was investing in all kinds of volatile energy instruments that nobody at the firm really understood. Certainly not the people who were making most of the investment decisions. And Lehman Brothers invested in all kinds of bizarre derivatives, including mortgage-backed securities, that nobody understood, or in the case of mortgage-backed securities, they had to have their eyes closed to not realize that if the housing bubble that Alan Greenspan was talking about collapsed, that all their mortgage-backed securities would collapse. So maybe that was wishful thinking. But so they were taking on huge debt. And in the case of both of these, if the CEOs had all their money in the firm, they wouldn't have done these things. And both firms were taking on a lot of debt. This was relatively new. And in both companies, because the CEO and the executive team made their money from stock options, they lied about profits in order to gain each time in order to gain stock option and bonus income every year, and until that fell apart, until they couldn't lie anymore. So Enron produced completely fraudulent financial reports, as we now know, thanks to Arthur Andersen. And Lehman Brothers didn't report their mortgage losses. So they tried to keep the thing going in both cases by pretending they made a lot of money that they didn't make, maybe in the hope that eventually they'd be able to recover that money. And so I'll leave you with one question. Could this have happened before, could either of these things have happened before the advent of shareholder value management as it became partially institutionalized? And I think they couldn't have happened. One reason is executives got almost nothing in stock options in 1980. So there wasn't much incentive at Lehman Brothers or at Enron to take crazy risks. Because when you're just making a salary, if you take a crazy risk, you might lose your job. When you're compensated with stock options, if you take a crazy risk, you might make $100 million next year and then be fired, but you don't care. Investment banks were still partnerships in 1980, most of them. So all the losses go to partners, but so they would have been crazy to invest in mortgage-backed securities that they didn't understand, or to close their eyes and say, no, there's no housing bubble, it can't happen here. Both Lehman and Enron were not highly leveraged in 1980 because firms in general didn't have as much debt. Lehman clearly went down just because of its leverage. It had way too much debt. And most firms, like Enron, in 1980 would have been diversified. So look at, for example, General Electric. They're still diversified. They do some energy stuff, but they also own NBC and all kinds of other things. So any industry can't bring the whole firm. A failure in any industry can't bring the whole firm down. So I think what we see is, as Glenn was saying, we see a rising importance of financial intermediaries determining the behavior of corporations. It is these mutual fund managers who decided that from this list of shareholder value proposals, firms only really had to do two things to make them happy. And that decision had a huge effect on the way firms did their business and on the level of risk-taking. And the problem with this system we have now is, with this new form of corporate capitalism, is none of the reforms of Sarbanes-Oxley, of Dodd-Frank, change the basics of this system. We still have a system that encourages high levels of risk-taking and that introduces almost no oversight, no monitoring, no constraints on that risk-taking.
Glenn, you seem to be suggesting that the flow aspect of capitalism is unified. I mean, are you making this argument? There are certain, I mean, it seems to me that there are systems of flow that are quite distinct. Just like institutions are different from country to country, you can also identify often systems of flows which are quite separate. And what would that do to your argument? There are different markets for mobile phones, for instance. And there's a huge difference between the world of the smartphone and the broadband and the market for mobile phones in Africa. Okay. For Frank, what I would like you to sort of tell us is that how is an institutional investor different from a shareholder, and how that explains the partial embracement of shareholder values Is it that institutional investors are more diversified and therefore they can allow more risk-taking than individual shareholders, and that explains the asymmetry? And what is it that makes an institutional investor different from a shareholder? And the last question is that on some of your graphs, there is a counter-trend starting around 2003 or 2002, for instance, net to equity. Is there, so before the crisis, is there any explanation for that?
The question of different sorts of flows, absolutely. I thought you were going to push me further on the financial flows, because clearly, there we want to distinguish different sorts of flows, different sorts of intermediaries, and we would have a more complicated picture there. So, I'm really, one of the things that interests me particularly is the flows from China. What are they conditional on? What might happen to slow those, what is happening to slow those flows down and to change where the surplus is going from Chinese businesses, so that rather than propping up treasury bills, it goes elsewhere. So I think we could dig a lot deeper into that whole question of flows. I think that might be of interest to Russian colleagues in terms of flows of Russian capital from raw material sector. Where does that go? Into buying Chelsea Football Club? So there's all sorts of strange things that are happening with these financial flows. So I certainly don't have a unified view of that. With regard to the question you put about phones, I was trying to say that there are multiple market possibilities, and so if we take the mobile phones, Nokia is still probably, I was looking for some statistics, can't find them quickly enough, it's still selling more phones than anybody else, but its profitability per phone, because it's selling into India, it's selling into Africa, is much lower. Meanwhile, it's losing the high end that it had, and so it's desperately trying to get back there. But that, again, that's partly about the diverse market possibilities that exist. So, I gave the example again with regard to cars of Toyota, increasing levels of variation, but also in Tata Industries in India or in Geely in China, you've actually got something that's more close to the Fordist model. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are multiple possibilities that these actors are all the time trying to seize hold of, but it's in an environment that is highly uncertain. So Nokia thought they were doing fine until a couple of years ago, because they were selling phones hand over fist still in these countries. So yeah, no unified flow of financial capital and multiple market possibilities for products that firms are producing using different models, different inputs of science, technology, labor, etc., etc.
So how is an institutional investor different from a shareholder? Institutional investors and CEOs now have the same interest in what happens to the market. So most actual shareholders, that is the people whose money institutional investors are investing, most shareholders are in it for the long run. That is, their money is in the market for decades because it's their pension. That's true in the United States. And it's even true for most sovereign wealth funds. So most shareholders want to see the market gradually go up over time and their shares increase in value over time. Institutional investors and CEOs want to see the market do this. They have a common interest in market volatility. And note that the markets have become much more volatile, much more up and down since 1980. I don't know if this plays much of a role. And here's why. Because as I said, neither of them loses anything when the value of their portfolio or the value of their firm collapses. But they both make money when the value of their firm or the value of their portfolio goes up. That is, stock options pay you for increasing the value of the firm from 1980 to 1981. But when it collapses in 1982, you get to keep that percentage of the increase. Same is true for institutional investors. Their bonus works the same way. And as a consequence, one thing you'll see is institutional investors, they had a bad year in 2008, but that was the only bad year they had, and they just didn't make much money. I mean, some of them managed to make money anyway, but every time the market goes down, they make money on the upswing. So if the market does this, or if your share price does this as a firm, as an institutional investor or CEO, you don't make nearly as much money as if the market does that. And that's why the whole incentive system is screwed up now.
But some of the themes are the same, and I've been thinking about them for a while. And theoretically, it sounds that your argument is not really with agency theory. It's a regret that agency theory was not followed. Jensen and Mecklen said that principals can trust agents best by turning the agents into principals. And if an agent has the same interest as the principal by being an owner, then, and only then, the agent will be trustworthy. And it seems to me that the story you just described is a story of opportunistic exploitation of agency theory by people who pretended to be following it, but weren't really following it. And so, as in the story of the investment banks, before they went public, the investment banks were under the control of principals, and then they weren't misbehaving. And it's when they changed their incentive structure that things went wrong. So I think theoretically, to really understand what went on, we need to move from agency theory to political economy. I talk about the political economy, capitalism, and talk about the power in the boardroom and how what was really going on in the boardroom was very different from what they claimed to be doing. But it seems to me that you are really critiquing what happened from the point of view of agency theory, and you're regretting that these agents weren't really principals. I'd up to your comment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't have a strong view of whether if agency theory was fully implemented, it would produce the right outcome. I think it's hard to know. But I think the interesting thing here is, as a sociologist, you get the social construction of a new theory of interest. And then, in principle, people are saying that it's been institutionalized, but in fact, it's been taken over by a particularly powerful group in this system who've convinced executives to convince firms to only put in certain parts of it. So to me, it's about this is really a story about institutionalization and the role of power in determining the shape that institutionalization takes. And but it's, when I sent this paper to a journal originally, they said, the journal was American Journal of Sociology, they said, oh, this is just agency theory. So, thanks, good comment.
I have a piece from Griffith University in Australia. I'd like to thank both the speakers and the organisers for choosing such a really interesting opening session. First of all, for Glenn, I really liked your talk. There were just a couple of times when I thought you were arguing that the changes in productive capital or industrial capital, whatever you want to call it, had driven the changes in the financial system and led to the financial crisis. Whereas I think that what's been argued by Frank, what I would argue is that if anything reversed it, the financial crisis would have happened independent of what's happening in productive capital. I'd just like your views on that. And secondly, for Frank, first of all, you mentioned right at the end some comments about the failure of regulatory changes and proposed regulatory changes to pick up the issues you've identified as leading to the problem of short-termism and volatility. What regulatory response would you recommend should be adopted to overcome the problems you've identified? And secondly, something that really arose from your answer to the previous question. Really, you've spoken about institutional investors and fund managers as if they're the same thing, and a lot of institutional investors really put their, as asset owners, put their funds in the hand of fund managers, and so I was wondering if you could just talk about the distance of interest, if you see it, between the owners of the assets and the fund managers themselves.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the point. I basically want to see industrial and financial capitalisms as co-involving, codependent. So I don't think I could imagine the financial crisis happening independently of all the changes that were going on in terms of the organisation of production across the world, and the impact that that was making on how flows of finance were going, both across national borders and within particular societies. So I think that, we probably need a longer discussion about this, but I recognise, and I would certainly want to say that there were some things happening within the financial sector that were clearly the main causes of the crisis at that point. But the preconditions for that, I think, were laid in terms of inequalities within societies and inequalities between societies that are generated in part through the mechanics, the dynamics of globalization and competition. So I think it's important to keep the two, somehow keep the two together rather than just focus on one or the other. So the financial crisis wasn't dependent upon the industrial changes, but nor was it independent of them.
Frank, did you want to respond to?
Yeah. What kinds of regulatory changes would be useful? Well, first, I guess I would want to say I see these talks fitting together very well because I'm kind of an illustration of Glenn's point about the difference between capitalism and capitalisms, and also the problems that are faced in particular capitalisms, even in what is so far the biggest capitalism. The problem, to my mind, the regulatory changes, the main problem is that they're designed by economists who think of the firm as an actor. And firms aren't actors, and the problems really arise from individual level action. That is, they arise from executives at large firms doing things, not thinking of the firm as a whole, not trying to keep the firm alive, but trying to increase their own stock options, the value of their own stock options. And that happened partly because agency theory defined their interests differently, because they used to get a salary, so their interest was in, they had a career interest in staying employed and in keeping their job or getting a better job. So I think that was a better interest for executives to have than increasing the value of their stock options from year to year. And I think agency theory did that in two ways. I mean, it did it in a very material way. It changed their compensation, but it also redefined people's interests. And so now everybody gets pay for performance. And that's moving to lots of other parts of the economy. Talk to psychologists about that, bad idea. No psychologist who you talk to about pay for performance will think it's a good idea. Why is that? Because if you pay people to do particular things, they come to think, oh, I'm just trying to do this particular thing. And this particular thing, in this case, is to increase the share value from year A to year B. So I think there's a big problem there. I think, how could you fix it? Eliminate stock options. If stock options were made legal by the IRS, they could be made illegal. That wouldn't be hard. The other thing you could fix is, in some countries, they require that the chairman of the board be a distinct person from the CEO. And I'm having trouble thinking of a theory of the world in which the chairman of the regulatory body of the corporation should be the CEO of the corporation. When you talk to lawyers about it, they just shake their heads. So those are two things I would do. where there are higher managers, so yeah, right. Institutional investors put their assets in the hands of fund managers themselves. So when I talk about institutional investors, I really mean the individuals, and sometimes the investment houses they work for, but I'm thinking about the individuals who are managing investments. Now, so take the example of Harvard University. Harvard institutional fund managers put money in places like Fidelity, some of the money. So they're fund managers who give money to other fund managers. But those fund managers, their incentive is to make more money through increasing the value of this portfolio that they manage. So when we talk about individuals across institutions, same interests. Harvard University, does it want to see this happen? No. In fact, we can't hire we haven't been able to hire anybody for senior colleagues since 2008 for exactly that reason. So.
We have time for one more question, yes?
Yeah, thank you very much for this talk. Very, very interesting. I wanted to bring up the issue of stock options. I think it's a very good point. There is this story that Arthur Levitt of the SEC was actually very actively thinking about changing the accounting for stock options, and then Congress told him that if he goes forward with that, the budget for the SEC will be cut. And I think he went actually public with that. He wrote it in a memoir or something. And that brings me to the political economy, essentially, and to another story that's going on at the same time, that is institutional investors do what they do, which is this thing that was institutionalized legally. And if you, I think both of you talk about elites, I think the second story is how the elites institutionalize this new capitalism, institutionally prevented from taking root.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of stock options and investment management is definitely an interesting one. But what I felt, and clearly the way in which elites interact with this is an important aspect. But one of the things that was visible or has been visible, is that a lot of investment funds will follow indices and will be more or less passive. And one of the things I was wondering about in terms of what you were discussing, Frank, was the degree to which or the significance of activist investment funds, because if we take the university pension scheme in the UK, a lot of that money is invested in tracking, and then there's a proportion of it that was invested with hedge funds, and they are, completely outside of were completely outside of regulation. They were dealing in all sorts of strange ways, and the rewards there, of course, are even more obscure than the rewards of the sort of standard institutional investors. So this arena of finance, this category of financial intermediaries, is actually, we could break that up into different parts, and there's actually some quite interesting things that happened during the financial crisis and after, as you described, where some people got off scot-free. And other people did lose their money. I mean, when you were talking about Enron, my memory was that a lot of the employees have had to invest in the pension scheme of Enron. So they did lose out. Even
the executives did fine.
Yeah.
It's a good question about elites. I mean, I think if you look at the American political economy now, the administration has been completely captured by Wall Street. Even the Obama administration has been captured by Wall Street. They are reluctant to do anything that Wall Street won't like. And I think the interesting thing about agency theory is I think it's had very wide-ranging effects, because because it has popularized pay for performance for lots of kinds of jobs. A lot of people get stock options now in big companies. A lot of people are incentivized for doing particular things, for meeting a particular goal, for example. And if you've read Jerry Davis is Managed by the Markets, he's really talking about how we all now think about our lives in much more financial terms. So we think about our house as an investment or as a hedge against inflation in the housing market in the long run. People buy apartments for their kids as a hedge against inflation, even though they think their kids will never live in them. I mean, so I think indeed this elite discourse that's promoted by the Chicago School and then more generally by agency theory as it's become, and shareholder value as it's become popularized, I think it very significantly affects how we think about the world. And also, I think one of the things that companies tend to do when faced with huge layoffs is, for example, is to say, but this is in the interest of our investors, and our investors are pensioners. And so we have to lay these people off because that's in the interest of the pensioners who own us, which is kind of a bullshit argument, but it is how they talk about it now. And so companies no longer talk about stakeholder capitalism. They no longer talk about the interests, say, of their own employees.